Today we've got a crazy revenge story against the neighbor's kid. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, my parents got what they deserved for their actions towards me. My parents ridiculed and drove me out of their home. I paid them back by exceeding all of their expectations of me. Guess who came crawling back when they needed me the most? I, male 26, for as long as I can remember, have always been the one and only child of my parents. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I don't have siblings or anything, but then the attention that's always been on me and me alone, I might have just very well have been the only child. For you to understand where I'm coming from, I want to give you a little backstory about my family, my parents, and the events surrounding my circumstances with my family, not especially my father, and ultimately the events that led to my telling you this story of mine. I am the first son of my parents, and there's no denying that fact. But I'm not the only child begotten from their marriage, as I have two immediate elder sisters, twins, and a younger sister. So simply put, myself alongside my father were the only males in our family. And along the line, I soon came to realize that this was going to be the case possibly forever, as my parents were no longer thinking of having another child from the moment they had our youngest addition to the family. Now, my father has always been some sort of an excessive disciplinarian. However, this only somehow applied to myself alone. He was always treating my sisters with the best care a father could possibly provide. I was almost never paying attention to this fact, as I felt like my mother's love was all I needed. However, much sooner along the line, my mother would soon turn her back on me, or that was how I saw and translated her actions anyways. The preferential treatment my twin sisters got from both my parents was eventually glaring when I was in high school, as following the sequential occurrence of a series of events, it eventually led to me having a total fallout with my parents. Back in high school, I would say I was somewhat of a social freak. I basically enjoyed meeting new people, and I've been told more than once that I have my way around people and also conversations. Basically, whenever it came to anything that had to do with relating with people and actually engaging them, I was always the first person you would expect to meet there. I believe that there was always something new to learn with every conversation I had with anyone, and this wasn't limited to the school setting, as even on social media, although I didn't have the best social media presence, I was still trying my best to make a name for myself, and this was most definitely evident. Now moving on, I guess you would be wondering what exactly the problem might be, or rather where the problem might arise from. Well, I can tell you confidently that at the time, I myself was wondering the same thing, as my father apparently was not satisfied with my grades. In his words, "You lack the focus and the zeal to become a better version of yourself, all because you like talking with people about stuff that are none of your concern." Now, I must admit, I was not a straight-A student. I've never been. But then again, I made sure not to fall behind my peers, and all while maintaining a standard and normal grade. I guess he believed that I needed to do better all for myself, and he apparently thought that the reason for my not doing as perfectly as he wanted in school was because of my overly active social life. So I did what I still don't believe till this day. I actually started working more and even harder on my grades, all just to please my father with an even better grade, as at least this would change his opinion of me and possibly get his approval and all. Well, no need to get your hopes up, as this act of mine was not even in the slightest bit effective enough for what I was intending. In fact, the funny thing is that it even made the whole situation worse for me. Let me explain. So, while I'd worked my behind off in making sure that there was a significant change in my grades, and for once I actually managed to get multiple A's in my grade compared to before when I could barely have one, now walk with me for a moment. Would it not be the joy of any and every parent to see this level of improvement from their child? Well, yeah, obviously. Newsflash, not mine. The only thing my father was focused on was the fact that, in his words, was the fact that I could have worked this hard from the very beginning, but I chose not to, was simply appalling and disappointing on multiple levels. I don't think my father had ever heard of a word called compliments, as it was something I'd never heard him say. Basically, from that moment onwards, I had received nothing but insults and basically threats upon threats, as he was simply ordering and demanding I simply just become better at everything and anything he wanted, or rather asked of me. Now on to my mother. From the very beginning, it seemed like she was always on my side. trying to pacify my father and make sure that things never got out of hand when I was receiving a scolding, which turned out to be almost every day at some point later in my high school life. However, that was not the case, as I would soon learn the hard way, in fact, that it was indeed my mother that was behind instigating and putting all of these absurd notions in my father's mind, as I guess she was only trying to show favor towards her first daughters and also her last. Which till this day, I have no idea why I just so happened to be the only one left out of the entire family. My mother was always putting up a nice little farce of always being there for me whenever my father was acting up. But when I figured out what was really going on, her true colors came out and my father's requests, or rather demands, became all the more impossible by the day, until he, or rather they both, gave me an ultimatum, which was either to move out of their home from the moment I was done with high school, or I would still remain in their home under their roof, and I would adhere strictly to the rules they were already planning on laying down. Now, as absurd as it sounded at the time, I was actually willing to work with what they'd laid down, considering I'd been living with them basically all of my life, and I couldn't imagine what the difference could be when I eventually agreed to their terms. Until I heard from them that I would start paying in installments back payments for none other than rent. Rent for all the times I'd spent living in their home. Now this was where I decided to draw the line. How could something like this even have occurred to them? I knew almost instantly that this was the thinking process of none other than my mother, as she was probably aware of the fact that I was already making a minuscule amount of revenue from my social media accounts and all. How did she know this? I have not the faintest idea. But then I just knew that she was the one behind this. And when I eventually turned down their offer, chose to move out of their home, this completely enraged my father. Initially, he didn't let me leave as he had quite a lot to say, a lot of insults and whatnot, all of which I was not going to let get to me initially. However, when he made mention of something along the lines of being a failure to him and his blood, the same blood that was running through my veins, this was when something in me snapped. I was just sick and tired of hearing that I was an apprentice failure. For as long as I can remember, my father had never said anything good about me in my entire 20 years of living at the time. Even after I'd done all that I possibly could to make him proud or even change his perception of me at the very least, it all just seemed like vain efforts, to be honest. And that very moment, his words flipped a switch in me. I spoke back to him, basically speaking my mind and letting him have a piece of it. And before I could put two and two together, I got my first and last beating from my father. All while my mother and siblings stood there and watched. It was really sickening, the idea of being related to every single one of them. Anyways, I took my beating like a man and I left without turning back for a single moment. It was at that moment that I decided deep down that I had no family and that I was all alone in this world. Now, following the recent actions back at home, I had nowhere else to go. I was practically alone with basically nothing to my name, but this didn't stop me as I still had one more thing I could call my own, and that could be beneficial to my life at this point, and this was surprisingly my social life. Basically, my social media accounts themselves. As over the next few years, with assistance and support from various online friends and my very humble online community and subscribers, I was able to get a suitable place for myself, provide the basic necessities, and also live without worrying of what I would have for breakfast, lunch, or dinner the next day. Or even wonder at all whether I was going to eat anything in the first place, as this was the case during the first 2 years of my fallout with my parents. Now, things didn't stop there. No, they didn't. The best part was yet to come. Now, unknowingly to me, I had racked up an exhilarating amount of subscribers, and my content was getting more recognition than I could have possibly hoped or even accounted for. And this had a resultant effect of drawing attention from several companies, seeking to make use of my audience for marketing purposes, which I would obviously be paid and compensated for. And just like that, I was slowly but surely attaining heights that were, a few years ago, seeming improbable. Now, I guess the news of my success must have gotten to the ears of my family, or so they called themselves, as it even got to them at the perfect time when they needed my help the most. My father had lost possession of the house to the bank, as he had lost his job about a year before that, and my mom also was not in a really good place back at the school where she worked. They were in desperate need of assistance at the time and they thought only of me. My sisters were also with them, as they were all in the same situation together. I was making well over 7 figures from every deal I was involved with annually, and it was only going to keep increasing as there was lots of untapped potential, according to my management team anyways, and it would have been no issue, or rather dent, on my finances, getting back to the home and paying off the mortgage completely, all while making sure that they never had to worry about working for their entire lives. But, I mean, we all know where I'm coming from and what I had to go through to get to where I am today. It was revenge time. After turning down visitations from them, my mother eventually found a way to meet up with me in person, and she started apologizing for her actions and how she treated me back then. She also pleaded on behalf of her family as she took full responsibility for what happened to me back then. I was not in the slightest bit okay with the way she was groveling on the floor, but then it wasn't like I didn't enjoy the feeling of knowing that I didn't even have to do anything for my payback. Honestly, a lot of times the best revenge is just you going off and living your best life and succeeding. There is like a slight curiosity to this if OP fully understood that their mom was behind all of this to begin with, like before moving out, or if it was something OP felt they realized after the fact when the mom started groveling saying, "Please help us with the rent, I did it all." Like if it was the latter, there is a small part of me that's like, maybe the father was behind the whole thing and is just putting the mom up to this, trying to get OP to sympathize. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is, was I in the wrong for telling my best friend's girlfriend about his promiscuous acts? My best friend, male 25, and I, male 24, have been best friends since we were both very young. In fact, I can't remember a time in my life when he wasn't there. We lived in the same neighborhood and we had quite a lot of notorious activities and memories in that same neighborhood. You can't blame us as we were quite young at the time. We both had nothing but ourselves to keep us company. We had quite a childhood summarily. We, however, weren't able to enjoy our childhood to the fullest as we had quite an unfortunate incident. Well, not really unfortunate per se, but then we got split apart due to his parents moving to a whole different city in a whole different time zone. Because apparently his mother had gotten a promotion at her workplace and she was meant to move to a different country at a different branch, hence the movement. His father, on the other hand, couldn't leave his wife in a whole different country all alone and taking care of the children all by herself, and so he also quit his job and decided to search for a new one when they'd fully relocated, as they had told my parents and also as my best friend had told me. Anyways, that was what I thought would be the end of our friendship, and for the first 2 months of his family's departure, I felt really lonely, and it seemed like there was an empty void deep in me that couldn't be filled no matter how hard I tried to take my mind off of things. We were still in contact with each other, but then it was not as we both were expecting it to be, as due to the different time zones, we rarely had the opportunity to even properly converse with each other as much as we had always wanted. And this was one of the things that had contributed in some way, form, shape, or manner to our slowly drifting apart over the next few years. Now, for the most part of my high school life, I never made a single friend, and this was majorly because I didn't even know what to do or where to begin when I was looking to make some new friends. And the entire idea of meeting new people was just seeming like more of a hassle at the time. And so I just decided to remain alone, as it wouldn't have as much of an effect on me as I was overthinking it would. Granted that I still met some people that I can just call my casual friends in high school, we never really got to the level that my best friend and I were at. Then I finally had my first conversation with my best friend after we both had not been in contact with each other for the most part of my high school life, and he was the one that first got in contact with me. Apparently he was planning on coming back to start college, as this has always been his plan from the very beginning. He realized that he'd been away for the longest time and that our friendship had apparently meant that much to him. I too came to the realization that I was also at fault for the stale nature and direction that our friendship took down the line. And somehow, just somehow, we were able to make up with each other, particularly over the time we both spent apart from each other. And then he went further to tell me that he was planning on coming back, but then he didn't have a place to stay. And I posited the idea of him living with my family to my parents. I was a bit scared, honestly, because this was the first time I would say something like this, and I didn't know what they were going to say, or rather how they were going to react. But then they surprised me and even went further to contact his parents and offer that they get a separate place for the both of us aside the college dorm. And they were totally on board, and just like that, we had completed the planning process. All that remained was for him to return, and he didn't take long for that as he was soon back home in less than a week. Now, following his arrival, there was a lot to uncover. Firstly, we had to figure out how things were going to be moving forward. It was almost like getting to know someone from scratch again. As back then, when we truly knew each other thoroughly, we were still kids and we practically knew next to nothing compared to the knowledge we both had separately gained apart. I must say, I never thought it would be as much fun as it was, but then it was a really refreshing feeling. We eventually resumed college about a month and a half after he had gotten back and we'd moved into our apartment. And thankfully he was there with me, as I don't think I ever would have gotten through the first few weeks of getting used to the new environment and basically new people. I think I was antisocial at the time, as it was clear that I abhorred social interactions. I at most times always wanted to keep to myself. However, my best friend made several efforts to ensure that this was not the case. He would always try to involve me in every and all things social in nature that he was obviously a part of, or rather a member of, and although initially there was serious reluctance and resistance from my end, I soon succumbed as it seemed inevitable at this point. And I must say, it was not a bad experience. For the better part of our first year in college, I was just getting myself introduced to actually having a social life outside the four walls of academia, and it was all thanks to my best friend. If I can remember clearly, right as we both were in our second year in college, that was around the time I crossed paths with the one person that would change the dynamics of my friendship with my best friend, and also all three of our lives, ultimately of course. It all started when my path and this damsel, let's call her Joyce, paths crossed. We both stumbled upon each other quite literally at the college library. I was preparing for a test which was supposed to be held in less than 24 hours, and I can remember feeling unprepared at the very least, hence my presence at the library. Joyce, on the other hand, was in a similar situation but just of a different nature. She had a deadline to meet, and she sought the library as it was the only quiet place she could calmly collect her thoughts. Now our eyes caught long glances at each other, and we eventually engaged in conversation as staring at each other for minutes was already seeming awkward enough as it was. We introduced ourselves, and within that short time, she quietly wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it in my hands as she walked away. I didn't even bother to check at the time because of the urgency of my situation. However, after I completed my tests and I was finally calm and collected enough to recall what had happened, I just so happened to remember that I got a note of some sorts, and I haven't even been the slightest bit curious as to what its contents were. And then I got to searching. I searched thoroughly, but to no avail. I just couldn't find it. I tried several and countless times to trace back my actions and movements from that day till the very moment I started searching for it, all to no avail. Then when I was on the verge of giving up, my best friend walked in and saw the way I was frantically in search of something. He thought to help me, as the extra set of hands would definitely go a long way. When I eventually told him what to be watching for, he finally told me that he'd thrown some unused papers in the trash while I was away for my test, and that it was unlikely that I was going to find whatever it was that I was searching or had been searching for. At that moment, I just lost all hope. I didn't know what else to do, as the only thing that really got to me was the fact that I had no idea what the details of the note was, and it was killing me. But then, the only solace I had was the fact that I met her just the one time. I just held this belief that I was going to meet her yet again, regardless of the location, and that was what I did. I waited, days turned to weeks and weeks to months. Just like that, it was seeming like things were not going to go as I had planned, until one day, out of the blue, my best friend had decided to bring a lady home, which he had initially told me of the day before. I wasn't in the slightest bit curious as to who he was bringing, but since he actually asked nicely and promised to make it up to me, as he wanted to make use of our room, I decided to pay it no mind. But then something deep down in me got just a little bit curious when I found out that he was bringing her over and why he was so keen on keeping her so secretive. when I know for a fact this wasn't the first time he was doing something like this and it had never bothered him before. He had brought several other girls to our apartments and he'd always told me about them beforehand. But this case was different, and I was determined to find out why. I left the room as planned, but I didn't go far, as we had agreed I would stay at the neighbor's next door as I anticipated his arrival. When he got home and I saw the lady friend he brought along, I was highly disappointed, surprisingly annoyed, and disgusted by who I saw with him. It didn't take me long to put two and two together to figure out what was going on. Apparently, my best friend found the note that Joyce had left me, and following the contents of the note, he was able to get in contact with her, and hence the reason they were apparently together. What I just couldn't wrap my head around was the fact that he did all of this simply out of selfish interest, as I would soon come to know that Joyce was also just another girl on his list of potential conquests. While I pondered for quite a while on what to do, as I was basically just speechless from that moment for about an hour, I finally decided that it was best I barged in on them, as this would even further complicate things for him, and that was what I did, without a moment's hesitation. When Joyce saw me walk in, she was simply confused as she had lots of questions, none of which triumphed over the fact that both Joyce and myself turned to my best friend for explanations. He didn't even know where to begin, but being the kind friend that I am, I decided to help him out and basically explain the entire situation to him without leaving out one single bit. I was also so generous as I told her about the other girls that had been there before her. When she heard everything from me, she gave him one of the nastiest hits on his cheek I'd ever seen before ultimately walking out on the entire situation, as she lost all interest in what was going on right then and there. As she left, my best friend was really furious as he began raining down questions upon questions, all of which I let fall on deaf ears as I just smirked and left the room, which got him all the more riled up. I don't think we would even go back to how close we once were, but then it is what it is, I guess. Definitely seems like the kind of friendship that is destined to kind of conclude there. Although I don't think it's too uncommon to get into kind of the college age range, and a lot of friends that you had from a long time ago you just kind of grow apart from, or you kind of realize they've turned into maybe a person you don't really like all that much. That said, our next story is, new neighbor's son thinks I'm some sort of pushover, so I stand my ground. We finally had a new neighbor after 6 years of having a vacant house opposite our house. I, 17-year-old male, live with my parents and younger brother at a suburb in Sydney. The house opposite ours has always been empty. I guess it had mostly to do with the fact that a lot of terrible things had happened there, and I'd always been there to witness them. The first lady who lived there had a stroke. Granted, she was an old woman living alone, but it was strange nonetheless. One minute she was watering her little garden of fresh herbs, and the next minute she just fell ill. Her children eventually came for her because she couldn't live alone. Then came Mr. George and his wife. They lived happily together for the first 3 years of being in the house, or so we thought, before his wife suddenly left him for another woman, and 3 years later, Mr. George was found deceased in his house. According to forensics, he'd been dead 4 days before the body was even found. This made my mom so sad and devastated. How could a neighbor filled with different people be so nonchalant about each other's well-being? So she always made sure to check up on the people next door, even though they sometimes found it bothersome. No one lived in the house after Mr. George till now. We had a new neighbor and my mom was more than happy to finally see someone living there. She worked her magic like she always did and found a way to invite them over for dinner. I always found it exhausting how she could just easily make her house available for any event ongoing in the community, and what even always pissed me off more was how I was always coincidentally arriving home each time they want to make suggestions on whose house they should go to for their next community meeting, and it always goes like this. "We should host the next community meeting somewhere new," her group members would say, and my mom would be like, "No, what do you mean? You're always welcome here. Same time next week." And I would see that look of relief on her other members' faces. That just annoyed me the more. I once asked my mom why she did that, and she just shrugged like it was nothing and said nothing. It always makes her look like a people pleaser, but I guess that's my mom. Anyways, she invited our new neighbor who turned out to be a single mom with her son and starts explaining the whole community dynamics while we were at dinner. My dad doesn't even take offense anymore, he just lets her do her thing while he watches the news or something. I, my younger brother, and our new neighbor's son were left at the table. My 10-year-old younger brother found a way to find something more interesting to do, so it was the two of us left looking at our empty plate in silence. I wasn't really good at socializing, but we found a way to get past the awkward silence and got talking. It turns out we had a lot in common. He was a pretty chill dude. His name was Dean. By the end of the night, we had covered a whole lot of things, mostly because he was easy to relate to. He was an only child, so he got lonely easily. We started this regular pattern of hanging out during the day. I had a few friends here and there, but they were mostly my classmates and lived a little far away from me. Besides, it was summer. School was closed and everyone had their own thing going on. Dean was always welcome to come over. My mom was finally glad to see me a bit more socially involved. She was always worried I was too introverted and would have a hard time making friends, unlike her. But I really had no problem making friends. It was just the kind of place we lived. They were mostly old people or families with grown adults. Dean and I always hung out. He was into most of the things I was into: anime, games, chess, and much more. He loved playing online games just as much, and it was nice to finally have someone to play with who was mature enough to handle losing a game like a grown adult, unlike my younger brother who always threw tantrums after he loses a game. I was even more thrilled when he mentioned he was going to be attending the same school as I was. He and I had a wonderful summer, and soon it was time to resume. I knew we were definitely going to be in the same grade. Different classrooms maybe, but same grade for sure. We took the bus together on resumption day and he went to the principal's office to submit his letter while I waited, and he was told he could officially start classes the next day. The next day comes and I go over to Dean's house as usual, but he had gone to school earlier. I didn't think much of it. I thought he had some things to sort out as a new student. I went to class and was going about my day. I sat down with friends during lunch break waiting for Dean to show up, and he did, only he was with some guys in his class. I guess he made some friends. He sat down with them and our eyes locked for a second. I give him a small wave just out of politeness, and this guy ignored me. I was stunned to get that reaction from him. It was just a wave. Why would any reasonable person do that? I thought I was being a bit over my head, but it turns out I wasn't, because by the end of the day, Dean and I saw each other outside the school parking lot and he didn't acknowledge my presence. I wasn't expecting him to walk up to me and just leave his friends, but I mean, a wave or a nod would have been fine. I went home with my school friends. We parted at the intersection as usual, and I saw Dean waving at me. I didn't acknowledge him too, because I wasn't going to pretend like I didn't notice how he became an entirely different person with his friends, and now that they had separated, it was cool to be friends with me. I went home without acknowledging Dean's presence, even though we rode the same bus. I could tell he was hesitant to come over to my side, and I was too angry to allow him to do that. He came over later that night and apologized for being rude. In his defense, he just didn't know how he could have dealt with a situation like that. I told him it was fine by me if we weren't friends in school, but it wasn't cool to ignore a friend, especially when exchanging pleasantries, and he promised to work better on his social skills. The next day, I didn't get a chance to see him. We hardly bumped into each other at school, but when we did, he always waved back or sometimes came over and we would talk for some minutes before we parted ways. I noticed whenever he was with friends, he always pretended like I didn't exist. I never understood that. I made mention of Dean's odd behavior to a friend who explained the trajectory of Dean's behavior to me. He explained to me that Dean wanted to fit in, and to do that, he couldn't be seen hanging around or talking to anyone other than his own crew, and that was a new level of crazy to me. I didn't know rules like this existed, and some were willing to go that far in the name of friendship. I decided to be less of a threat to Dean's plan and stopped greeting him at school. Although I found it absurd that someone would go through that length to be friends with a group of people, I wasn't judging. We still talked and we both visited each other's places to watch a movie or play a game, but we weren't so close at school. I didn't realize how desperate Dean was to fit into this crew until this particular day when his mom asked me to drop off his breakfast because he forgot to eat before leaving, and I went to his classroom with the intention of doing that, only this time Dean was with his friends. I decided to summon the courage to drop off his lunchbox to him, but it turned out to be a bad idea. He and his group of friends looked at me like I was some pervert for tapping Dean on his shoulder and probably for disturbing their vibes. I could tell immediately I wasn't welcomed, but I decided they could screw themselves and told Dean I needed to see him. But Dean decided to play the dumb guy card and refused to come outside. I gave him the box as requested by his mom in front of his friends, and these idiots found it funny that an 8th grader still had a lunch box. It was chaotic. Dean was embarrassed while I was fuming in anger. Dean flung the box away so hard that it broke and told me never to come near him again. At that moment, I told myself I was done taking his crap. He never came over to my house. It was his way of telling me we weren't friends anymore. After a few weeks, my mom noticed and began asking questions. She naturally assumed I did something wrong without wanting to hear what happened between us. A few weeks passes and everything's back to normal. I go to school, hang out with my friends, go home. Sometimes I bump into Dean, but we both act like we don't know each other and get on with our lives. Until one day, Dean and his friends come over to his house in one of his friends' cars. I saw them drive into the driveway as I was heading inside, and I guess they saw me too because 30 minutes later, these guys come over to my house with Dean. From the looks of their faces, I knew they were up to no good, and as luck would have it, I was the only one at home. One of them pushed his way into the house, knocking me down, but this must have given the remaining 3 of them the morale to move in, Dean included. They sat down, and I immediately told them they weren't welcome inside. There was a lot of back and forth. It was 1 against 4, so I knew I was cornered, but I wasn't going to look weak in any way, no matter how much they tried to frighten me. We ended up getting into a fight and it got brutal. I had injuries and a bloody face while they ran off from my house. I had to clean up myself before my mom arrived from picking up my younger brother, and when she saw the state I was in, she was shocked. I went to the hospital to get my wound dressed while my mom kept demanding an explanation I didn't give. By the next week, I was a bit better and I could officially go back to school. The first thing I did as soon as I got to school was to beat up Dean. I made sure to beat him up to a pulp because he was responsible for bringing those idiots to my house. The school staff got involved and so did the principal. Both our moms got called in, and while the principal explained the situation to my mom, I expected her to immediately tell me to apologize to Dean. But to my surprise, she stood up for me. Dean's mom and her almost got into a fight. I had never seen my mom so livid. She eventually told the principal I was assaulted at home and nothing was done about it, so all I did was pay back a bully for bullying me. I felt so proud of my mom for backing me up. She and Dean's mom do not get along till date, as I also don't get along with Dean. But for the first time ever, my mom was nonchalant about someone, and it was very assuring to know she had my back. Well, it's good to know that all it takes is OP getting brutally beaten up for the mom to finally take OP's side and consider that OP's not the problem. I mean, it's kind of a nice relationship flip towards the end between OP and their mom, but it was pretty rough getting there. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.